So, Steve Kornacki, let's look at the group of candidates who hope to defeat him a year and a half from now. And the new Morning Consult poll, we've got the national number, which shows Joe Biden with a healthy lead now and a growing lead, but also some interesting information as we go through these inside African-American voters and young voters.
Yeah, significant movement here in the Morning Consult poll. They've been doing this every week. We haven't seen movement lately, but there it is. Biden, after the announcement last week that he's a candidate, you see him moving up to 36% there. That gap with Sanders, we've been talking about a pretty narrow gap between them. Now that sits at 14%. Biden, we've been saying overall, if you talk about the Democratic electorate, extremely high favorable score. Some of the other candidates have that as well. But one thing I think that's a potential read of this is that there was a certain segment, maybe a certain segment of the Democratic electorate that was looking at Joe Biden, that liked him a lot. They thought there'd been false starts in the past. Guy's going to be 78 years old. Is he actually going to run for president? And it may have made a difference to a certain number of Democrats just seeing him put that video out there, just seeing him go on television last week and say, yes, I'm here. This is real. I'm running. And the polling profile of a candidate, a frontrunner sitting in the mid to high 30s versus somebody sitting back in the mid to high 20s in terms of their prospects of winning the nomination, I think those are two different stories. So there's a real bounce here. The question is that bounce replicated in other polls? Is he able to sustain that bounce? But if he is, and we start looking at numbers like this going forward, this is a different polling profile for Biden than I think we've been talking about in terms of his prospects. And yes, one of the other really interesting findings of this, start looking at these subgroups, race and gender. Who does Biden poll best with here? Black women. Race and gender, who does he poll worse with? White men. There are a lot of aspects of the Democratic coalition and Biden's appeal to it that will defy what you'd learn from social media and the sense you get there of where the Democratic Party is.
That's a 23-point spread if you're listening in the car in this new poll. Joe Biden at 43% among African-American voters, Bernie Sanders at 20%, and Kamala Harris at 10%. We'll get into some of the other crosstabs with young voters, older voters, but these almost across the board are really strong numbers for Joe Biden.
Wow.
Well, you know, and we had Yamiche on the show about a week ago, Willie, and she pointed out the most important subgroup among Democrats, black women.
Yep.
The most important group, because we always look at, you know, I said last week, beware the blue check marks, beware the elites in Washington and the elites in L.A. and the elites, you know, in New York that are driving the discussion on social media. It is, in the Democratic primary, black women who are the backbone of the Democratic process, the Democratic primary process. They were the ones that made such a huge difference in electing Doug Jones to the Senate. And by the way, Roy Moore thinking about running there again. Doug Jones, he should actually just stay right where he is. I'm sure he's feeling good about that. But the fact that Joe Biden is doing well among black women, that's extraordinarily important because that's a group that Bernie Sanders has not done well with, did not do well with 4 years ago. And that's going to be a real challenge for Pete Buttigieg. So for Biden, that's great news.
Yeah, so let's look in some of the younger voters. Bernie Sanders actually has the lead there at 36%. Joe Biden, though, at 23%, a 13-point spread at the top. Everybody else well behind. And then among older voters, as we take a look at 65 plus, you have Joe Biden at 48%. Pete Buttigieg at 11, Bernie Sanders at 10. What do you see in those numbers, Steve?
And that's a pattern we've been seeing. There is an age divide when it comes certainly to Sanders' appeal to the Democratic electorate. Every poll we've been seeing, this is the oldest group you have here, 65 plus, but really at about 45 years old, about 50 years old, you really start seeing Sanders' support take a hit. Biden has struggled more, as you see here, when you get under 45, and particularly the youngest possible group right there. But I think one of the realities of the Democratic Party, what I say, is that may be at odds with the perception you get from social media. Is we talk a lot about changing Democratic Party, millennial voters, young voters, more liberal. There are still an awful lot of 45 pluses in the Democratic Party.
Yeah. And Joe, he was looking really good in Pittsburgh yesterday at a rally.
He was. I'll be honest. I was surprised how well he did.
Let's take a look.
Donald Trump is the only president who's decided not to represent the whole country. The president has his base. We need a president who works for all Americans. And we can afford this. We can do this. folks, everybody knows who Donald Trump is. And I believe and hope they know who we are. We have to let them know who we are. We Democrats and we independents who have the same view have to choose hope over fear, unity over division, and maybe most importantly, truth over lies.
Gene Robinson, it's hopeful in a candidate on the Democratic side to see someone with the experience, with that whole, Obama-era hope, as well as, what Biden is bringing to the table in his performance right now. I think some of us were leaning in and watching and seeing how he was doing, hoping that he looked as good as he did. I thought he sounded great and was hitting all the notes.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that you look at those numbers, the polling profile is a front-runner's profile at this point, or it's certainly getting there. Yeah. I mean, you can kind of say that about him. I think those numbers are not great for Bernie Sanders and are pretty awful for the rest of the field. Going into the, getting into the meat of the campaign, everything that was said about support of black women is true and really important in a Democratic primary process. And what Biden has is a kind of stature as a former vice president, the association with President Obama, of course. One thing Democratic primary voters are going to be doing, I think, is picturing the potential Democratic candidate standing on a debate stage across from Donald Trump. And what's that going to look like? How's that going to play? How's that going to work? And so far, I think Biden is reassuring a lot of Democrats that he looked pretty good on that stage. Now, it's a long campaign. It's Joe Biden. So let's, we won't make any sort of permanent judgments at this point, but I've got to say he's had a spectacular launch to his campaign.
Elise, I know it'll surprise you, but when Kenny Rogers sang about the gambler, he was not thinking about Donald J. Trump. Because Donald Trump has the worst poker face, I think, in the history of modern American politics. He was sort of on a meltdown yesterday about Joe Biden being in old Joe's home state of Pennsylvania. And there was a tweet storm about it. You can tell he's really scared of Biden. And he understands that this year is going to be all about Pennsylvania, 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 and he has drawn the worst card in Joe Biden if he wants to win Pennsylvania.
Well, Joe, talking about a poker face, it's really hard to maintain a poker face with your competition when you tweet out exactly what you think. And I found it very telling that President Trump was definitely unnerved by the union support that Joe Biden enlisted yesterday and was ripping into union leadership as taking money from the rank and file, and he still maintains his support. But I thought that shows that Joe Biden has definitely gotten under his skin, and that the way Joe Biden is going about attacking him, not directly head on, but referencing the lies and the lack of moral character, and definitely making Donald Trump part of his case for defeating him, that the character of the man does matter, has been effective and has gotten in Donald Trump's head.
John Heilman, we need to say it's early, it's early, it's early. So there you go. He said it 3 times. It is early. That said, Joe Biden does look, at least in the polls that we're seeing right now, Biden does look like a guy that if he keeps it in the middle of the road, is going to be in pretty good shape. You look at the rest of the field after Bernie, and boy, it falls off so quickly, which I got to say, for many of those candidates, that may be the biggest surprise so far in the 2016 campaign. It's not like somebody that introduced themselves to Americans 6 weeks ago and is now polling at 4 or 5% is going to have a magical moment on a debate stage with 20 people.
Yeah, it's a challenge, and I think the size of the field is going to make it harder. I think another way of saying what you're saying is that the size of the field makes it harder for a lot of these very talented, very promising first-time candidates to have that kind of moment. And you've seen you've seen some people. Mayor Pete is the one who's obviously had the kind of magical ride early and has become a household name to some extent among a lot of Democrats, when having gone from not being known at all. Biden, there's a lot of what people say. Biden's they have said for a while that Biden's numbers reflect mostly name ID and the fact that he's so familiar. That is true, and yet it also puts him in a position where, as you say, if he can keep it in the middle of the road. Now that is where he has a dominant position at the outset. The big question is, can he keep it in the middle of the road? And we've said a lot of times on this show, and everybody has pointed out that his history as a presidential candidate, if you look at his two previous runs, there's not a lot to suggest. He's not had a lot of success in the past keeping it in the middle of the road. Maybe this time will be different. He's learned a lot. 8 years as vice president, had him on the road pretty much constantly, and it might be possible. It might be possible for him if he takes the lessons of that time. But that's the real challenge for Joe Biden right now, is whether he can keep himself from making the kind of mistakes that proved fatal to him in his previous two runs.
And Mika, Joe alluded to this a minute ago with the blue checkmark reference, but I think what these numbers show as well are the issues that have obsessed some of the media and the activist class, which includes the hugs that made people uncomfortable, the crime bill, the Anita Hill question. Yes, he's addressed them. Yes, there are some concerns about them, but their voters anyway are ready to look forward and not back.
Yeah, not listening to that at all.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.